They told me my husband died in a car accident on a rain-slicked highway outside of Richmond. That was the official story. That was what I repeated to the chaplain, to the funeral home, to the flag-folding officer, who pressed the triangle into my hands like it was supposed to mean something. But 3 days after we buried him, his billionaire boss called me at midnight and said the words that split my world in half. "Don't tell your stepmother. Don't tell your sister. You could be in danger." I drove to his office not knowing I was about to see a dead man standing in it. My name is Chloe Evans. I'm 42 years old, a major in the United States Army, and until 11 days ago, I was a wife. I've spent most of my adult life learning how to keep my hands steady when everything around me is falling apart. 3 deployments will do that to you. I've stood in rooms where the walls shook from mortar fire close enough to rattle my teeth, and I never once let my voice crack. But nothing, not one single day in uniform, prepared me for the sound of a chaplain's careful, rehearsed voice telling me that my husband was gone. Michael was the steady one. That's the joke we used to make, the two of us late at night with a bottle of wine between us on the back porch. I fought wars overseas. He fought spreadsheets and boardrooms as CFO of Whitmore Technologies, the private tech empire built by a reclusive billionaire named Richard Whitmore. Michael handled the house, the bills, the school forms for our nephew who stayed with us summers, the small, unglamorous architecture of a life. I was gone 8 months out of 12 some years. He never once complained. He used to tell me, "Somebody has to hold the fort, Chloe. Might as well be the guy who's good at math." He was 46. He had a runner's build he never lost, even after 2 kids and 40 years of living salt starting to show at his temples, and this quiet way of looking at you like he already knew what you were going to say before you said it. I loved him in the unglamorous way you love someone after 17 years, not the fireworks kind of love, but the kind that's load-bearing. The kind you don't examine because you're too busy leaning on it. Then came the phone call from the highway patrol, and after that the funeral. I remember standing at the graveside in my dress uniform because I couldn't bring myself to wear anything else, some absurd instinct that if I stood at attention long enough I could hold myself together through sheer muscle memory. Linda, my stepmother, cried loud enough that people 2 rows back turned their heads. Vanessa, my stepsister, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue that never seemed to actually touch her face. I watched them the way I used to watch terrain during reconnaissance, looking for what didn't add up. And something didn't add up. It hadn't added up for years, if I'm honest with myself, but grief has a way of making you generous with people you shouldn't be generous with. I told myself it was paranoia. I told myself grief makes liars out of our own instincts. 3 days after the funeral, my phone rang at 11:50 at night. I almost didn't answer a number I didn't recognize, and by then I'd had enough condolence calls from people I barely remembered to last a lifetime. But something made me pick up. Chloe. The voice was low-controlled, the voice of a man used to being obeyed. "This is Richard Whitmore. I found something that belonged to Michael. I need you to come to the office, tonight if you can." I sat up straight in the dark of our bedroom. Michael's side of the bed still untouched, like some part of me thought that if I didn't disturb it, none of this would be permanent. "Mr. Whitmore, it's midnight. I know what time it is." A pause, and in that pause, I heard something I didn't expect from a man worth 11 figures. I heard fear. "Chloe, listen to me carefully. Don't tell your stepmother. Don't tell your sister. Don't tell anyone where you're going. You could be in danger." The line went quiet after that, just his breathing and mine, 2 people standing at the edge of something neither of us wanted to name out loud. I didn't ask questions. 17 years of marriage to a numbers man had taught me that when someone that careful, that precise breaks protocol to call you in the middle of the night, you don't waste time asking why. You move. I pulled on jeans, a jacket, Michael's old field coat that still smelled faintly like his cologne, and I drove through empty streets with my hands tight on the wheel the way I used to grip a rifle before a patrol, not out of panic, but out of readiness. Whitmore Technologies occupied the top 4 floors of a glass tower downtown dark that night, except for a single lit window on the 40th floor. Michael's old office. Security let me up without a word, like they'd been told to expect me. The elevator climbed in silence. My own reflection stared back at me in the polished doors, a woman I barely recognized, hollow around the eye's jaw, set waiting for a fight she didn't yet understand. The doors to Michael's old office were open. Richard Whitmore stood near the window with his back to me, the city lights spread out below him like a field of dying stars. But it wasn't Richard who made my breath catch in my throat. There was another man in the room, tall gray at the temples, standing very still near the desk, like he'd been waiting a long time for this exact moment. He turned around, and when I saw his face, the floor seemed to tilt beneath me, 17 years of certainty, collapsing into a single impossible thought. Impossible, I whispered, my voice barely my own. You died 8 years ago. The man standing in my dead husband's office was Daniel Brooks. I hadn't said that name out loud in 8 years. Nobody had, not since the fire that supposedly took his life in a warehouse downtown, back when he was still an internal investigator for Whitmore Technologies, the quiet man who used to bring his kids to the company picnics, who once helped me change a flat tire in the rain because Michael was stuck in some meeting that ran long. I remembered the funeral. I remembered his wife weeping into a folded flag, not unlike the one I now had sitting on my own mantel. I remembered thinking at the time how strange grief was, how it made even strangers feel like family for one single afternoon. And now he was standing here alive in a gray suit that fit him like it had been tailored for exactly this moment, like he'd been rehearsing his own resurrection. Chloe. His voice was steady, careful, the voice of a man who had spent 8 years learning how to disappear. I know this is a shock. I need you to sit down. I didn't move. My hands had gone cold, the particular cold that comes not from temperature, but from the body bracing itself against something it doesn't yet have language for. You're supposed to be dead, I said. And even as the words left my mouth, I heard how absurd they sounded, how the whole room seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what I'd do next. Richard finally turned from the window. He looked older than I remembered from the handful of galas Michael used to drag me to, the kind of tired that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying something heavy for a very long time. Chloe, please, sit. There's a great deal you need to understand and very little time to explain it. I sat because my legs had started shaking in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the sheer physics of standing up straight, while your entire understanding of the last 8 years rearranges itself. Daniel pulled a chair across from me close enough that I could see the fine lines around his eyes, the small scar along his jawline that I didn't remember from before, evidence of a life lived somewhere else under some other name for 8 quiet years. I didn't die in that fire, he said. Richard helped me disappear. I'd uncovered something inside the company embezzlement going back years, tied to people with more power than they should have had. It wasn't safe for me to stay Daniel Brooks anymore, so I stopped being him. Why now? My voice came out sharper than I intended, edged with something between grief and fury. Why show yourself now after Michael? I couldn't finish the sentence. Some words are too heavy to carry all the way to the end. Daniel's jaw tightened. Because 2 months ago Michael found me. He tracked me down through a contact I thought was buried, and he asked me to help him with something. Not company business, Chloe. He paused, and in that pause I felt the ground shift again. Family business, yours. The word landed like a stone, dropped into still water rings, spreading outward until they touched every corner of the room. He'd been investigating for almost a year, Daniel continued, quietly. He never told you because he didn't want to worry you while you were deployed, and because he wasn't sure yet what he was looking at. But what he found, Chloe, it wasn't inside Whitmore Technologies, it was inside your own family. My stepmother's face rose unbidden in my mind, the practiced tears at the funeral, the way she'd held Vanessa's hand a little too tightly, like she was steadying someone rather than comforting them. I'd noticed it and dismissed it as nothing. Grief makes you generous with people you shouldn't be generous with. Daniel reached into his jacket and produced a small lockbox, brass-cornered, the kind of thing that looked like it belonged in another century. He set it on the desk between us with the careful reverence of a man handling something sacred. Michael gave me this 3 weeks before he died, he said. He told me if anything ever happened to him, I was to make sure it reached you. Only you, not your stepmother, not your sister. He was very specific about that. My hands trembled as I reached for the box. Inside, when Daniel turned the small key, I found a USB drive, a leather-bound journal with Michael's cramped, careful handwriting, filling every page, a small brass key I didn't recognize. and a stack of handwritten letters tied with a length of red ribbon, the same color ribbon Michael always used to wrap my birthday gifts, some private joke between us that meant nothing to anyone else in the world. He never believed the accident was random, Daniel said quietly, and something in his tone made the hair rise on the back of my neck. Those were his words to me almost exactly. He said, if I die, look at her family first. I stared at him. Somewhere beneath the ringing in my ears, some part of me, the soldier, the part trained to notice when a room has changed, registered movement outside the window. A black SUV had pulled to the curb below headlights, cutting through the dark doors, opening in that unhurried, deliberate way that told me whoever was inside wasn't in any rush because they weren't afraid of being caught. Daniel followed my gaze. His face went still in a way I recognized from men who have learned the hard way what danger looks like before it arrives. He crossed to the window, watched for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to barely more than breath. "They're here." Richard moved fast for a man his age, crossing the office in 3 strides and pulling a bookshelf away from the wall to reveal a narrow door. I never would have noticed the kind of thing built into old buildings by men who understood that money attracts people who don't knock. "This way," he said, and there was no question in his voice, only the flat certainty of someone who had done this before. Daniel scooped the lockbox and its contents back into a leather satchel, and I followed them both down a set of concrete stairs that smelled like dust and old rain, my heart hammering in a rhythm I hadn't felt since my last deployment. That particular alertness where your whole body becomes an instrument for reading danger. We came out into a private sub-basement, a room I hadn't known existed beneath a building I'd walked into 100 times over the years, waiting for Michael to finish some late meeting. Concrete walls, a bank of monitors, a heavy steel door that Richard sealed behind us with the practiced motion of a man who had built this room for exactly this kind of night. "You have a panic room," I said, and even in the middle of everything, some absurd part of me wanted to laugh at how surreal my life had become in the span of 11 days. "I have several," Richard said without a trace of humor. "In my line of work, paranoia is a survival skill, not a diagnosis." He gestured toward a bank of monitors, one of which showed the black SUV still idling at the curb, 2 figures now standing beside it in the orange wash of the streetlight faces, obscured by the angle of the camera. "They've been watching this building for 3 days, ever since Daniel resurfaced." "Who were they?" I asked, though some smaller, quieter part of me already suspected I didn't want the answer. Daniel set the satchel on a steel table bolted to the floor and opened it again more carefully, this time laying out the journal, the letters, the small brass key. "Michael suspected your stepmother had help. Someone watching, someone willing to do more than watch if it came to that." He looked at me, and there was something almost apologetic in his expression, like a man delivering a diagnosis he wished he could take back. "Chloe, how much do you actually know about what happened to your father's estate after he passed?" The question landed sideways, disorienting, because it had nothing to do with Michael, and everything to do with a wound I'd stopped picking at years ago. "My father died when I was 34, midway through my 2nd deployment. Linda had married him 11 years before that, and by the time I made it home for the funeral, most of the paperwork had already been handled. To spare you the burden," she'd told me, dabbing at eyes that never seemed quite wet enough. "Linda managed everything," I said slowly. "The house, the accounts. I was overseas. I trusted her." "Michael didn't," Daniel said gently. "Not entirely. About a year ago he started noticing discrepancies filings that didn't match what your father's original will specified a trust account that had been quietly restructured signatures on documents that Michael didn't believe were authentic. He brought it to me because he didn't know who else he could trust with something this close to home." Richard exhaled slowly, and when he spoke, his voice carried the particular weariness of a man confessing something he'd rather have kept buried. "Linda and Vanessa attempted to reach out to Michael directly more than once in the months before he died. They wanted him to help move certain assets, your assets, Chloe, into a different trust structure, one that would have effectively removed you as beneficiary while you were overseas and unable to object." The words moved through me slowly like cold water, finding its way into every crack. I thought of every long deployment, every months-long silence where I'd trusted the people back home to hold things steady in my absence. The way Michael held the fort the way I'd assumed, without ever really questioning it that Linda was doing the same. Daniel opened the leather journal to a page marked with a torn strip of paper and turned it toward me. Michael's handwriting, small and precise, filled the margins with dates, names, dollar figures circled twice for emphasis. He documented everything he found. He was building a case, Chloe, quietly. He never told you because he didn't want you to carry this while you were downrange, and because until the last few months he wasn't entirely certain what he was looking at. He reached past the journal and lifted a small silver flash drive from the satchel, turning it over once in his fingers, before handing it to me like it weighed more than metal should. "There's a video on here. He recorded it about 6 weeks before the accident. I think it's time you saw it." My hands were steadier than I expected as I took it, though something in my chest had gone tight and small, bracing itself the way you brace before opening a door you already suspect leads somewhere terrible. Richard connected the drive to one of the monitors, and after a moment of black screen and static, Michael's face filled it, tired, a little thinner than I remembered from those last weeks, but unmistakably him, unmistakably alive in a way that made my throat close up entirely. He looked directly into the camera the way he used to look at me across the dinner table, like there was no one else in the world worth his attention. "If you're watching this," he said, and his voice broke something loose in my chest that I'd been holding together with sheer willpower since the funeral. "I'm probably gone." I sat very still watching my husband speak to me from beyond a death I still hadn't finished grieving. "Your greatest enemy," he said quietly, "was never on the battlefield." The screen went dark. Somewhere behind me, Richard's phone buzzed once sharp and sudden in the silence of the room. He answered, listened for a long moment, his face going pale in the blue light of the monitors, and when he lowered the phone, his hand was not quite steady. "That was my security team," he said. "Someone just broke into your house, Chloe." 2 unmarked cars flanked us the entire drive back to my house. Richard's security detail moving in formation like they'd rehearsed this exact scenario 100 times before it ever happened. I rode in silence beside Daniel, watching familiar streets blur past the window streets Michael and I had driven 1,000 times together, and thinking how strange it was that grief and fear could occupy the same body at the same time without canceling each other out. 2 patrol cars sat in my driveway when we arrived, lights washing red and blue across the front of the house I'd shared with my husband for 12 years. A young officer met me at the door, his expression carefully neutral in the way cops learn to hold their faces when they don't yet know how bad the news is going to land. "Ma'am, someone forced entry through the back door. Whoever it was, they were gone before our units arrived. Nothing appears to have been taken from the main living areas." The main living areas. I repeated, and something cold settled in my stomach because I already knew with the particular certainty that comes from marrying a careful man exactly where they'd have gone looking. Michael kept a small home office off the garage, a room he'd converted years ago from what used to be storage space, and inside it bolted into the concrete floor beneath a false panel. He thought I didn't know about. I'd found it once by accident dusting and simply never mentioned it because some part of me understood he needed a place that was entirely his own. Sat a heavy steel safe. I walked through my own house like a stranger, the officer trailing behind me. Daniel and Richard a step further back, all 3 of them watching me with the particular caution people reserve for someone standing at the edge of a cliff. The office door hung open. The false panel had been pried up and cast aside splinters of wood scattered across the floor like something had been torn out of the earth rather than simply removed. And the safe stood open. Its heavy door hanging crooked on one hinge, gouged and forced by tools that had clearly been brought for exactly this purpose. It was empty. I stood there for a long moment, staring into that dark, hollowed-out space, feeling something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite despair, some third thing that didn't have a name yet. "He moved everything," Daniel said quietly from the doorway, and I turned to find him studying the wreckage with the flat, assessing look of a man who had spent a career reading crime scenes for what they didn't show as much as what they did. Months ago, from the look of that dust pattern, whoever broke in tonight was looking for something that hadn't been here in a long time. Richard crouched beside the ruined safe, running a gloved finger along the inside edge, And when he stood, his expression had shifted into something grimmer, more focused. "Michael was thorough," he said. "He knew someone might come looking eventually. He just made certain there'd be nothing left to find." We sat in my living room afterward, the three of us, while the officers finished their report outside, and Daniel finally opened the last item from the satchel, a plain envelope unmarked, sealed with the kind of careful precision Michael brought to everything he touched. Inside were documents that took my breath away, one page at a time, a copy of a will dated only 4 months before Michael's death, a series of bank records, a stack of photographs that Daniel laid out on the coffee table like a hand of cards. The photographs showed Linda in the parking lot of a downtown law office, deep in conversation with a man in an expensive suit. Another showed Vanessa meeting with someone at a coffee shop, papers spread between them, a business card visible on the table that read in small professional print insurance brokerage services. "Michael believed," Richard said carefully, "that someone in your family had motive to want him removed from the picture. Not necessarily to harm you directly, Chloe, but to remove the one person standing between them and full control of your father's estate." I stared at the photographs, feeling something in my chest crack open wide and raw. "You're telling me someone wanted him dead?" Nobody answered right away, and the silence in that room said more than words could have. Richard finally cleared his throat, choosing his next words with obvious care. "There's something else you need to know. Michael used a portion of his own savings quietly over the last several years to purchase a substantial stake in Whitmore Technologies. He never held those shares in his own name." "Then whose name are they in?" Richard met my eyes, and something in his expression told me the answer before he said it out loud. "Yours, Chloe. He put everything in a trust with you as sole beneficiary. You've owned a significant piece of this company for over 2 years, and I don't believe you had any idea." The number he named a moment later didn't feel real, didn't feel like it belonged to my life. The modest, quiet life I'd built around deployments and homecomings, and a husband who loved me enough to build an entire second life in secret, just to protect me from something he couldn't yet name out loud. Daniel gathered the documents back into neat order, his hands steady in a way that told me he'd had 8 years to practice staying calm while the world came apart around him. "There's one more person you need to speak with," he said quietly. "Someone who can help us understand exactly what Michael was building before he died, and exactly what your stepmother and stepsister are still trying to finish." I decided that night that grief could wait. It sat there in my chest the way it had every day since the funeral, heavy and constant, but I folded it away like a soldier folding a flag carefully with both hands, to be dealt with later when the mission was finished. Because that's what this had become. A mission. Michael had spent the last months of his life building a case quietly, methodically, the way he balanced a ledger, and I understood now that finishing it was the last thing I could still do for him. Daniel introduced me 2 days later to a forensic accountant named Patricia Voss, a soft-spoken woman in her 60s who had spent 30 years untangling exactly this kind of fraud for federal prosecutors before retiring into private consulting. She spread Michael's documents across her dining room table like a surgeon laying out instruments, and within an hour she'd built a timeline that made my stomach turn, years of small, careful diversions from my father's estate, dressed up in language complicated enough that nobody without a forensic eye would ever have noticed. "Your husband was very good at this," Patricia told me not unkindly. "He built a case that would hold up in court. What he didn't have when he died was proof of intent. Proof that this wasn't just financial mismanagement, but something closer to a conspiracy." That was when I made a decision that surprised even me, sitting there at Patricia's table with cold coffee in front of me and my husband's careful handwriting spread out like evidence in my own trial. I decided to lie, not to the authorities, not to Richard or Daniel or Patricia, to Linda and Vanessa. I decided that the version of Chloe they'd see going forward would be the grieving widow they expected, soft, disoriented, easy to manage. A woman who didn't know she owned a piece of a tech empire worth tens of millions of dollars. A woman still trusting enough to sign whatever was put in front of her. It wasn't difficult to play, honestly. Some days the grief wasn't even acting. Linda called within the week, her voice syrup-sweet over the phone, the same voice she'd used at every family gathering for the past 11 years, the one that always made something in me want to check the logs. "Sweetheart, I know this is the worst time, but we do need to talk about your father's estate paperwork. There are some documents that need updating now that Michael's gone." I said yes. I said I trusted her. I said the words I knew she wanted to hear and felt something cold and steady settle over me as I said them. Not unlike the calm that used to come over me before a mission, the particular quiet that isn't the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. Vanessa came by the house a few days later with a folder of papers and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, walking me through language about simplifying, the trust, about protecting me from the burden of managing complicated assets while I grieved. I nodded along. I asked the kinds of questions a confused, exhausted widow might ask. I signed nothing, of course. Patricia had warned me not yet, but I let them believe I was close, that a little more pressure would finish the job. Meanwhile, Daniel worked quietly in the background, installing a small recording device in the sitting room, where Linda and Vanessa always insisted on meeting, the room with the good light, the room where Michael used to read the paper on Sunday mornings. Richard, for his part, began laying the groundwork for something larger, a shareholders' meeting scheduled 6 weeks out ostensibly, to formalize the transfer of Michael's estate holdings following his death. Linda and Vanessa believed that meeting would be the moment everything finally came to them. They grew bolder as the weeks passed, the way people do when they believe they've won. Vanessa let something slip during one of our meetings, some offhand comment about how Michael had gotten too curious for his own good toward the end, and I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, my heart hammering, and simply nodded like a woman who hadn't quite caught the weight of what had just been said. Later that night, alone in the house that no longer felt entirely like mine, I played the recording back for Daniel and Richard, my voice steady even as my hands weren't. "They think it's over," I told them. "They think Michael's evidence disappeared with him." Richard studied me for a long moment, the careful assessing look of a man used to reading people across a boardroom table. "And the shareholders' meeting?" "They'll come," I said. "Linda's been asking Vanessa for weeks what she's going to wear." There was something almost unbearable in saying it out loud, the casual cruelty of two women planning their triumph over the ruins of a family, while the man who'd tried to stop them lay in the ground less than 3 months. The morning of the meeting arrived gray and overcast, the kind of sky Michael used to call funeral weather, which felt in hindsight like something closer to prophecy than joke. I dressed carefully, not in black this time, but in a sharp navy suit Michael had once told me made me look like I could run the company myself, a joke between us that had turned out apparently to be closer to true than either of us knew. Linda and Vanessa arrived at the Whitmore Technologies building at exactly 9, dressed for a celebration they didn't yet know wasn't theirs to have. The doors of the boardroom opened at 9:15. A man I didn't recognize walked in carrying a black case, and the moment I saw Linda's face change, I knew that whatever came next would be the last untruth either of us ever told each other. The boardroom at Whitmore Technologies occupied the entire top-floor glass walls on 3 sides, so the city spread out beneath us like something we all owned a piece of, though only one of us actually did. Linda sat near the head of the table in a cream-colored dress she'd clearly chosen for the occasion, her hair freshly done, the particular glow of a woman who believes she's about to be rewarded for patience. Vanessa sat beside her, scrolling through her phone with the studied boredom of someone who has already spent the money in her head a dozen times over. I sat across from them, flanked by Richard on one side and Patricia Voss on the other, my hands folded in my lap the same way they'd been folded during 100 debriefings overseas, still composed, giving away nothing. Richard opened the meeting with the kind of measured, unhurried authority I imagine he'd used in 1,000 boardrooms before this one. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "Today we'll be finalizing matters related to Michael Evans's estate, including the disposition of certain shares held in trust." Linda's smile widened just slightly, the way a smile widens when someone hears exactly what they've been waiting to hear. "Before we begin," Richard continued, "I'd like to introduce someone. Daniel Brooks, many of you will remember, was an internal investigator here for several years before his death 8 years ago." The room went very still. Vanessa's phone lowered slowly. Linda's smile did not move, but something behind her eyes did a small flicker, like a candle catching a draft. The doors opened and Daniel walked in carrying a black case, setting it on the table with the deliberate calm of a man who had waited 8 years for this exact moment. "I'm not dead," he said simply. "I disappeared to protect an investigation, and I'm here today because Michael Evans asked me to make sure this reached the people it belongs to." Linda's composure cracked just at the edges the way ice cracks before it finally gives. "This is absurd," she said, her voice climbing half an octave higher than the honeyed tone I'd grown up hearing across the dinner table. "Chloe, what is this?" I looked at her, really looked at her for what felt like the first time in years past the careful hair and the practiced tears at the funeral and 11 years of small cruelties dressed up as concern. And I said quietly, "It's the truth, Linda. Something Michael spent the last year of his life making sure I'd eventually find." Patricia opened her laptop and began walking the room through the financial timeline she'd built the diverted funds from my father's estate. The falsified trust restructuring the signatures that forensic analysis had flagged as inconsistent with my father's authentic hand. Vanessa's face drained of color somewhere around the third slide. Linda's jaw tightened into a hard, thin line, the mask finally slipping to reveal something colder underneath. "You have no proof any of this was intentional," Linda said, and her voice had dropped now quiet in a way that felt more dangerous than her earlier volume. "Financial mismanagement isn't a crime, Patricia. People make mistakes." "They do," Patricia agreed evenly. "But mistakes don't usually come with forged signatures and a paper trail specifically designed to hide asset transfers from a beneficiary serving overseas." Daniel opened the black case and connected a small drive to the display at the end of the table. "There's something else," he said. "Michael recorded a great deal in the final months of his life. He was careful, methodical, thorough, everything he always was." The screen flickered to life and Michael's face filled it, and I watched Linda's whole body go rigid at the sight of him, this man she'd apparently underestimated so badly it had cost her everything. He spoke for several minutes, laying out what he'd found with the same calm precision he brought to every quarterly report he'd ever walked me through at our kitchen table. The falsified documents, the trust restructuring, the meetings with lawyers and insurance brokers that Linda and Vanessa believed had gone entirely unnoticed. And then, near the end, he played something else, an audio recording dated months before his death, the quality rough, but the voices unmistakable. Linda's voice tinny through the speakers, talking to someone I couldn't see. "If Michael disappears, everything gets so much easier. Chloe's never home long enough to manage any of this herself." The room went absolutely silent. Vanessa turned to look at her mother with an expression I'd never seen on her before. Not guilt exactly, but something close to horror. The particular horror of realizing you've been standing beside someone capable of more than you let yourself believe. "That's taken out of context," Linda said, but her voice had lost all its honey, now gone thin and brittle, and I could see in her eyes the exact moment she understood there was no context that would save her. Richard closed his laptop with quiet finality. "The board has reviewed all documentation with outside legal counsel over the past several weeks," he said. "Effective today, all shares and assets held in the Evans Family Trust, including Michael's holdings in this company, revert fully and solely to Chloe Evans, as specified in the trust documentation he filed prior to his death." Vanessa began to cry real tears this time, nothing like the performance at the funeral. Linda simply sat very still, staring at the table at her own hands, as though she could somehow will the last hour backward into something survivable. I stood, finally feeling something in my chest loosen for the first time in 11 days. Not relief, not yet, but something adjacent to it. The particular stillness that comes after a long operation finally reaches its objective. "He knew," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "He knew what you were doing, and instead of confronting you, he built a case strong enough that you'd never be able to talk your way out of it. That was Michael. Quiet until it mattered." Security appeared at the doorway, then 2 officers who had been waiting outside for exactly this moment, and as they moved toward Linda, the door opened once more, and a man in a gray suit stepped through, flashing a badge toward the room. "Mrs. Linda Evans," he said, his voice flat, official, final. "We need to ask you some questions about your son-in-law's death." 6 months passed before the investigation reached its conclusion, and I spent most of them the way I'd spent every hard season of my life, showing up, doing the work in front of me, and refusing to let the ache in my chest become the whole of who I was. The federal investigators built their case slowly, the way careful people build anything meant to last. They confirmed what Michael had already suspected in the final months of his life, that the falsified trust documents were only the surface of something deeper, a pattern of financial fraud and insurance manipulation stretching back nearly 4 years, involving a small network of professionals who had been more than willing to help Linda and Vanessa move money that was never theirs to move. Whether any single act of that fraud reached all the way into the circumstances of Michael's accident remained in the end a question the courts could only partially answer. Enough evidence to raise serious concern. Not enough, the prosecutor told me gently, to prove intent beyond doubt in a court of law. I learned to hold that ambiguity the way I'd learned to hold everything else that year, without letting it collapse me. What the courts could prove, they proved thoroughly. Linda pleaded guilty to fraud and forgery charges tied to the estate manipulation, and to obstruction charges related to the destruction of financial records, once she realized an investigation was closing in. Vanessa, who cooperated fully, once she understood the weight of what her mother had built around her, received a lighter sentence, probation and restitution. And something in me, some old, tired, complicated piece of family loyalty I hadn't fully let go of, was quietly grateful the courts saw a difference between the woman who orchestrated the scheme and the daughter who'd simply been too weak or too frightened to walk away from it. I visited Vanessa once before her sentencing in a small visiting room that smelled like disinfectant and old coffee. She looked smaller than I remembered, stripped of the polish she used to wear like armor. "I didn't know," she said, and there were real tears this time, not the performance from the funeral. "About Michael, I swear to you, Chloe, I didn't know what she was capable of." I believed her mostly. I've learned that people can be complicit in things they don't fully understand, can stand close enough to darkness to be warmed by it, without ever quite looking at what's casting the shadow. I told her I hoped she'd build something honest with whatever came next. I meant it. I haven't spoken to her since, but I think about her sometimes the way you think about a house you used to live in gone strange and unfamiliar in memory. Richard Whitmore stepped down as CEO of Whitmore Technologies that spring quietly, without the fanfare you might expect from a man of his stature. He told me over coffee in his office one last time before he cleared out his desk that Michael's death had changed something fundamental in how he thought about the company he'd spent 30 years building. "I built an empire," he said, looking out at the same skyline Michael must have looked at 1,000 times. "And somewhere along the way I stopped noticing the people inside it." Michael noticed. He noticed everything. It cost him everything in the end, but he never stopped being the most honest man in any room he walked into. Before he left, he handed control of a charitable foundation, one Michael had quietly founded years earlier, and never told me about, funded modestly from his own savings, aimed at supporting military families navigating exactly the kind of long-distance, high-stakes marriage Michael and I had built our life around, fully over to me. "He wanted you to have this eventually," Richard said. "I think he simply ran out of time to tell you himself. I kept serving." That surprised some people, I think friends who assumed that inheriting a fortune, uncovering a family betrayal, surviving something this large might make a person want to walk away from the discipline and hardship of military life. But the Army had never been the hard part of my life. It had been the steady part, the part that gave me a place to put my hands when everything else felt like it was slipping. I took command of a new post that summer, and I brought Michael's foundation with me, quietly growing it into something that mattered, a scholarship in his name for military families who'd lost a spouse, and separate support funding for veterans navigating the particular loneliness of coming home to nothing familiar. The final letter I saved for last. Daniel had told me all those months ago that there was one more envelope in Michael's collection, sealed and dated the week before his death, meant to be opened only once everything else had settled. I waited until the trial concluded, until Linda's sentencing was final, until the last quiet business of that terrible year had been put to rest, before I finally sat down at our kitchen table alone and opened it. His handwriting filled 2 pages, careful as always, and near the end he'd written something that I've read so many times since that I no longer need the page in front of me to recite it. I couldn't choose how my story ended, but I could choose how yours begins. I sat there for a long time after I finished reading, the house quiet around me, the way it had been quiet for months, except that the silence felt different now, not empty exactly, but full of something I couldn't quite name. I walked out onto the back porch where we used to sit with wine and easy conversation, and I looked up at a sky scattered with more stars than the city usually let you see, and for the first time since the chaplain's voice had first told me Michael was gone, I felt something in my chest come fully quietly unclenched. I wasn't living in the dark anymore. I was standing finally in the light he'd spent his whole quiet, careful life building for me. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear which part hit you hardest. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. We've got so many more stories like this one waiting for you, so make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications because you won't want to miss what's coming next. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. Let's keep walking through these stories together.